Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit,
a podcast that takes a closer look at the IT industry, both the good and the bad.
My name is Cameron Plato.
And I'm Brian Law.
And I'm Brian Link.
Today, on episode 3, we're going to get a little personal. In our first 2 episodes, you heard a somewhat stream of consciousness group conversation between me and the 2 co-founders, Brian Law and Cameron Plato. We wanted to set up why we are doing this podcast, what our goals are, and some of the main industry issues that frustrate us. Nothing wrong with that, but we thought since this is a brand new series, we should take a step back and properly introduce the people you are hearing from. And we're going to start today with a one-on-one with Cameron Plato, our CEO and one of the original co-founders. Cameron, thanks again for agreeing to go under the microscope with me.
Thanks, Link. You're a gentleman and a scholar.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. All right, so let's just jump right in. Before we kind of get to some, straightforward questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in IT?
So I was in the music business back at the time Napster started to take off, and I quickly realized you couldn't make music in the money in the music business. Couldn't make music in the music business at that time either, it seemed. So I was dating a girl whose dad was the CIO of a company here in Nashville, and he had said, "Hey, look, you're doing all this work with computers in your day job. Why don't you come over here and do it for some cash so you can at least afford to take my daughter to dinner?" And that's exactly how it started. So I worked on the service desk for some time, and bottom of the barrel in terms of what I didn't know, and worked my way up through director of IT at that organization. It was a $1 billion company. We probably had about 10,000 employees or so at the time. So it was quite a climb up the corporate ladder pretty quick. I ended up frustrated with a lot of the vendors and supposed partners that we had as an organization. Everybody and their brother's trying to sell you something, especially when you're in the news. So I decided that maybe I could fix that. I could change that experience. And so I decided to jump ship and go over to the supply side, if you will, or to the VAR side of the world, to hopefully craft an experience that was more in line with what I expected as a buyer. I went in that as a technical leader, led an engineering team for a VAR, a national VAR, for a bit, and then realized very quickly the sales team I felt was in my way, and I thought I could do that better, and so I stepped out. And by the way, all along, you always start with great plans, but you think you can do it better, and you realize it's an uphill battle, and not everybody's doing a bad job because they're incapable. There's a lot of hurdles in there. So
hang on just for a second. So VAR, value-added reseller, tell us a little bit about what were you guys selling? That could be a lot of different things.
Sure. Yeah. So we sold everything from end user computing devices back to the infrastructure in the data center. I tended to lean more towards data center infrastructure, network infrastructure, just because that was my background. Networking's been the core of my skill set and focus. There for a time I was a well-decorated Novell engineer, so if that dates me some, that'll give you a sense of how long I've been.
You're so young, Cameron. You're so young.
Right? So
half of our audience has no idea what Novell is, so there you go.
Baby. Back in the IPX, SPX days, before TCP/IP took over. So Banyan Vines, even, I got some. In case
we needed to establish our nerd bona fides, we just did.
Yeah, there we go. That was for you guys. But yeah, what did we sell? It's primarily data center infrastructure.
Gotcha.
And professional services to employ that sort of thing. It was at a time in the industry where virtualization wasn't really mainstream yet, so there was a lot of capacity of stuff moving around, and frankly, very inefficient use of resources. I mean, I'd be surprised if anything we sold ever got more than 30% utilization. So it was right at the time when the wave of the move towards consolidation and virtualization was just getting started. This is probably in the 2003-04 timeline.
Right.
When we really started to dial things up, but yeah, I hope does that answer your question.
Yeah, it does. I just wanted to get a sense of what got you to kind of the plow story, which I know the timeline obviously kicks in 2011, 2012, but it kind of went back a couple of years, I think, before that. I think you and Brian got to know each other in late the late 2000s. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So Brian led a telecom sales team, if you will, when I first met him at a national level. He had, I think, 1,000 or so sales reps. I mean, it was a big organization, but he happened to lay his head in Nashville on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and then he was out on the road again. So one of his top reps I had a relationship with the same company he worked for, and we had mutual clients. And since I brought attention to the fact that I was in networking, there's always telecom associated with networking.
Right.
So I had a relationship with one of his sellers, and the guy kept he's like, you got to meet Brian Law. He's like, the things you're saying, the way you're approaching things, your sort of philosophies and ideologies here are so similar to that of Brian's. You guys really need to meet. And both Brian and I were busy, and I think we didn't really feel like we needed any more friends. We had enough, and there was enough going on. So reluctantly, one day we met. And you know what? It was kind of one of those love at first sight things. We were like, you know what? Hey, man, we really are kind of cut from the same cloth. We got the same vision,
man, we
same
love
ideals.
We love a bromance story. I love a bromance story.
It was at Cracker Barrel for our sponsor, Cracker Barrel. We sat at Cracker Barrel from
Product
about
placement.
7 a.m. to, we were probably there till 1 p.m. I mean, we really just set aside a bunch of time just to compare and contrast all of these things. And we decided that, man, we really should stay in touch. So this was in I think probably 2006 or 2007. Fast forward to about 2009, I decided the changes in the industry. The company I was working for had been sold off to a larger organization that was rolling us up, and it just was not satisfying. Wasn't rewarding. There was a lot of hurdles that needed to be jumped that just were unnecessary and frankly were impacting our clients. And so I said to hell with it, took my ball and went home and left. Started a new company with a couple of the guys I'd worked with before, and Brian was supposed to come and join that company at that time. The way things work, as they always do, the company Brian was with offered him a position to take over the channel, indirect sales, for the entire U.S. And frankly, it was just an offer that was too good to pass up. And so Brian reluctantly took that position, and with hopes that he could join up with us at a later date. It was all kind of still in his heart. So fast forward a couple years down the road, and Brian decided, hey, it's time to come over. I had some partnership challenges with my existing partners in that business. You can imagine they were a little frustrated with the fact that here comes this guy that hasn't been here for the 2 years of the heavy lifting to build the company. He's just going to come in as an equal shareholder. So that created some friction, to say the least. But I had such a strong connection to Brian and the way he operates and what he wanted to do and what we wanted to do with that shared vision that I had a tough decision to make, and that was, do I fight this tooth and nail and incorporate him into the existing organization, or do I, cut bait and start over again with Brian the way I'd intended to? And the vision at that point was both of us were so bullish on this idea of cloud services and telecom and network services and hosted managed services being the future, that the blessing in disguise was by getting with Brian, we had to start over, and we had a non-compete. We couldn't sell traditional IT assets. We couldn't sell traditional resources, so we were forced into this managed services, subscription, telecom, hosting space. We just couldn't do anything else for the first 3 years. It was a blessing in disguise that we were locked out of the market, and we were forced to do things the way we intended to do long term. But it just made
Why do you say it's a blessing in disguise? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's very easy in this business, the IT business, to get back into the legacy way of doing things. You can sell one big deal with a lot of equipment, make a bunch of money up front, and that money sits, and you go do another deal and so on and so forth. All that cash flow comes up front. The move from legacy VARs or traditional resellers, integrators, if you will, into this modern era is very difficult. You're staffed up, and your cash flow requirements are typically built around these one-time deals, these big chunks of cash coming in. Right. And when you move to these managed services deals or these subscription-hosted deals, it may all add up in the end, but it's a whole bunch of nickels. Like, they just come in a little bit at a time, right. And so it's tough to build a business, and it's certainly difficult to staff a business around this annuity that has to build up some volume before things are stable. Now, I'd like to say this blessing in disguise, because you look at uncertainty in the marketplace, such as what we've had with this last couple of years with COVID. If we had to deal with, if we were fully dependent upon one-time project type revenue to keep the company afloat, we'd be out of luck. I mean, people pause doing projects. You've got a bunch of mouths to feed. You've got a bunch of employees. That gets really tough if you don't have that annuity stream built up enough to support things. So that's why I say it's a blessing in disguise. It would have been
getting over that initial hump
is
the challenge, right? And
yes.
and the allure of being able to get those front end commissions from larger sales, because that wasn't there, sort of pushed you maybe a little faster in that direction than you would have gone.
For sure. And the previous company Dad had that we intend to have Brian come along with, even as under my leadership, it was our MO to drive recurring residual revenue, more subscription model and hosted services, managed services. But, rest assured, when the going got tough, it was easier to go out and sell one-time deals and get the money in the business. And so we had become exactly what we had set out to not be. So it wasn't that hard for me to make a decision to say to hell with it and cut bait on that organization and move on. There's days of remorse where you feel like you could have maybe done more with that, but that's in the early stages. We're 9 years into this now, and we've been headstrong on doing it the way we want to do it, and good or bad, I don't know, but it I think ultimately
depends on the day, right?
To the right place. Yeah, I'm happy with where we're at. So
okay, well let's transition just a smidge. Let's go. So since starting Plow, and you think about the industry, and you've seen a bunch of trends and changes in 9 years, what change or lack of change has surprised you the most as you sort of look back?
That's a great question. I don't think that change is surprising to me of any sort. There's always constant change in this space. I mean, that's the one thing that I find. Look, I think there's really three people, and this is probably going to offend folks, but there's three people that are into IT: nerds, mathematicians, and musicians. That for whatever reason they seem to flock to it. And I don't know if it's just a right brain, left brain thing or whatever it is, but I'm excited. I get a little nerded out. I'm a musician by trade, but I get a little nerded out in the IT industry because there's just constant creativity and innovation and reinvention, and that's exciting to me to see it. It's cool, but it's exciting to me when you see it get put to good use, when you see the true impact of this innovation over time. So I'd say not much surprises me. There's a bunch of smart people working on some really difficult things, and they oftentimes put it to good use. The things that surprise me by inaction are the industry's tolerance, the organization's tolerance for lack of production or lack of outcomes is always surprising to me. I literally think that every day I wake up thinking that something's got to change. Like, we got to start holding the expense and the complexity and the investment of time and effort and resources into these technical solutions accountable for outcomes, accountable for delivery. And some reason, year after year after year, we find our clients or just the consumers as a whole being tolerant to these solutions, which are extremely expensive solutions typically. We become tolerant to the failure to deliver. That always surprises me, like it's a new thing every day. What's
your theory on that? I have one. I'm curious what yours is.
I think it's complexity. I think complexity, at least my theory is that there's always a shiny object to refocus your attention on, and where there's complexity, I think that you find people who are perfectly capable of understanding what all this stuff it does or is supposed to do, but I think they get overwhelmed and frustrated with it, and so they just throw up their hands and say to hell with it and move on. That's my thought.
Gotcha.
What's yours?
Yeah, mine's more the David Copperfield theory. I think technology is so much like magic. And for most of us, even though we're theoretically digital natives now, we've watched this stuff unfold and really change so dramatically right before our eyes that it seems like magic. And so I think, almost emotionally think we can't understand it in the same way that somehow we would think about people as an investment or an expectation of return from having people do certain things, even though there's probably a great case to be made that we're very poor at managing HR resources as well. But we certainly expect to be able to understand what return we should get from those assets. And we just don't seem to think about technology the same way. And the only thing I can think of is that there's there's a little bit of pixie dust around it that sort of blinds us. I don't know if that's true, but
I think that's a good answer. I think there's certainly.
It's fun. I get to talk about magicians, so I can't beat that.
I'll agree with you on that.
So nothing changed. Nothing surprises you. Lots of changes. When you kind of look forward, not real far. Let's not play future casting, but near term. In the near term, maybe next 2-3 years. What excites you the most when you think about trends in IT?
If you were to give the listener one choice, I would bet the vast majority of listeners would guess what my answer is going to be accurately. So go ahead and write it down.
I was going to say, we'll have to ask now.
On-demand capacity, on-demand resourcing, and that obviously is cloud, right? The potential that the interconnectivity and that the cloud offers is immense. And it's just barely being tapped by what I would call the traditional IT consumer. People in the SaaS space, people in the hosting space, they get it. They've been doing it all along, at least if they're smart, they have been. But it feels like the consumers are just now starting to embrace it. And so I think that and leveraging the power of AI is, and really, truly, that can probably only be reasonably accomplished by the general consuming public through cloud services. So leveraging AI, I think, is going to be the game changers. You look at some of the practical applications of that, like in the healthcare space, specifically like decision support. If you look at doctors, you look at what doctors do today. I mean, the value in being a doctor, or the value of a doctor, is an experience. It's a way they can assimilate all of the experiences they've had, all the things they've seen, to try to come to a reasonable conclusion or hypothesis. Where now you've got massive scale computing resources making all that decision at a scale that's so far beyond what any individual human can contribute, or even a board or a panel of experts can contribute. So you kind of look at the role of like a healthcare provider. They become more of a priest. They're more like saying, "Hey, this is to make you feel better, but this is what the data says." So that's how powerful this stuff is when applied properly. So yeah, that the ability to embrace and securely embrace, maybe better said, cloud resources and leveraging AI. Those are the two things. I know you asked me for one, I gave you two. But.
No, that's fine. And when I think about on-demand computing and on-demand resources, right, it kind of feels like we spent 2 decades building up infrastructure to provide or handle max capacity. And now we're sort of going down the other side of the hill and saying, maybe we don't need that. How do we transition from that to an on-demand world where we spin up what we need and spin it down when we don't, right? Which is philosophically, it's a completely different way of thinking about the world than what you were describing in your early days, right? In the data center, world.
Yeah. I'll tell you that maybe one other thing to add in there that I think is extremely powerful and enabling would be just the notion of pervasive 5G technologies, high capacity bandwidth everywhere all the time. Just what you can do with that in terms of sensor data, and it's immense. Network without the network. First of all, the network itself, we all knew it was important. Now it's critical. Like it's absolutely paramount importance. If you don't have a reliable network, you might as well just kiss all the things we just talked about goodbye. You're only as good as your weakest link, and the network is the link. So,
careful with that, and then careful with those kinds of analogies. Just saying.
Yeah. The deployment of 5G and the successful integration of 5G technologies is also the other thing that I'm giddy about.
Got it. Okay. Let's go back inside Plow and kind of, as you sort of look back 9 years, a 9-year history. What would you describe, if you had to sort of define it, what would you think you and Brian's biggest disappointment has been business-wise?
So the word disappointment's kind of interesting. I would say usually it's self-directed frustration might be a better question. So get your questions better next time, Link.
I'm working on it. I'm working on
it. I think early on when you start a business, you feel like your job is to convince people who are out there that somehow what you've built is worthy of their time and effort. Like you spend a lot of time and effort just trying to sell people on the idea that this is something bigger than two men in a truck. And then you start to make compromises about the types of resources or people that you bring on. So for me, it's been, where we've knowingly made compromises in hopes that a person or a resource would be a good fit. It doesn't mean that person's not good. It just means that they're not what we needed. They're not what we were looking for. So not choosing the best and not just holding out until we got the exact right person. I think that's led to more frustrations for us than anything. And I'm sure frustrating for that employee as well. But I'd say that's where the disappointment, if you want to restate that through a disappointment, it'd be disappointed in ourselves for not holding true to our founding principles of hiring the best and brightest, enabling those folks to flourish.
Yeah, I think hiring is one of those things. It's probably the hardest thing to do in business, period. I think most people would agree. And when you're in a small company, right, where you don't have as many folks, everyone seems to matter more, right? There's less nodes, right? So everyone has a bigger role to play because of that. And so I think the stakes, they go up even higher for hiring in a small company. And so I'm
sure.
not surprised to hear that. And I think a lot of small business folks would say the same thing, that it's a hard thing to do. And then looking back, there were things that maybe they should have known or told themselves a story they wanted to hear about a particular hire that maybe wasn't, it was clear you could have seen it, but you didn't make that decision for a lot of reasons. Oftentimes because you really needed somebody to do something, right?
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
Agreed.
You've been in the IT services industry a long time. You've been in this game a while. And it's clear there's a number of things about the broader industry that frustrate you. We've talked some about those in our first couple of podcasts, and we'll get into more of those as we go along. But let's go positive for a second. What is something that you think the industry, really as a whole, has done pretty well and continues to do well?
Well, I usually try to make sure that any benefit that is as a result of this industry being on the face of the earth has something to do with a customer benefit. But I'm going to have to reach a little bit on that one. I'll say that as the industry as a whole does a really good job of giving people that may not fit into a normal profession an opportunity to find a good paying career. I see a lot of guys that maybe weren't four-year college degree guys that are just technically, frankly, brilliant people that needed a home. And for some reason, the IT industry, if someone's creative and precise and methodical and more system-oriented in thinking, there's a place for them. And you can really make a good living in this space. So I see one of the sort of side benefits of it is that it's created an industry where a lot of people have found relative success. So they produce good output and that's rewarding and valuable for them and customers alike. So I think, I don't know if it's maybe a cheating answer, but I feel like that's one of the big positives. The second thing is, I think that where we sit in the industry in terms of between the customer and the manufacturers or the OEMs, I think we do an okay job. I think we could do a much better job of voicing the customer or proxying the customer's interests and desires, and kind of bridging the gap between what the technology is intended to do and how it plays out in terms of a meaningful outcome to the customers. Not only for one, it's not parity like one-to-one, it's more like an industry as a whole. So if we can look at, let's say, the healthcare provider industry and the freight and logistics industry. There are some parallels. There are some interesting challenges that present themselves in very different spaces. It's up to us in our position to try to amalgamate all that and to consolidate it into such a form that the OEMs will take that feedback and then change their innovation cycle or change their direction to satisfy those numerous different client desires or demands. We do an okay job of that. I think we're in a position to do a much better job of it as an industry, and I wish we could somehow find a way to get those feedback loops consolidated or aggregated into something meaningful for the customers or for the manufacturers as well as the investors. I mean, people put money behind these tech companies, big money. I think that if we could narrow the gap between the ideation that the customer has and the fulfillment or realization on the provider or manufacturer side, we'd be doing them all a good service. So
I think the first part of your answer is pretty interesting. The IT industry is normally thought of as the tech industry, right? Which normally makes people go to Silicon Valley, and you kind of get into this sort of the best and the brightest, uber smart, that kind of thing. But in reality, it's a pretty egalitarian space, right? Contrast it to, say, investment banking, right? Or top-end legal firms where that's a credential-driven recruiting experience. You can be the smartest guy in the world, but it's almost impossible to get an associate gig at an investment banking firm if you didn't go to the right school, for example. That's right. I mean, it's possible, but almost impossible. And IT is the exact opposite, to your point. It's very egalitarian, and I think it's interesting how why aren't those lessons getting learned in a broader sense, right? Because it's also associated with being the best and the brightest. So it seems to me a bit of a contradiction in terms, but that's right. That's a opinion editor commentary there, but it is interesting that you pick up on that. Let's kind of wrap it up. We've been talking for a bit. This is a new series, obviously something Plow's never done before with Cut the Shit. And so I was just curious, talk a little bit about what are your goals? What would you think of as listener goals from your perspective? Meaning, what do you hope the audience who's listening, what do you hope they get from this?
Well, other than not being able to get their 15 or 20 minutes of their life back, I hope that they start to sense that...
We hope they don't think that at the end of each episode. Well, it would only be one, but I understand.
So I would say this. I get the sense, because in my travels I've come across a lot of IT leaders. I've come across some that I think are just absolute geniuses, some of the best and brightest, to use that again. But I come across a lot of people who are untapped in terms of their potential in IT leadership, and it seems to be that a lot of the hang up there or the hurdle is it's a lonely spot. When you're leading, you're dealing with mysterious stuff. You've got a team of people who are typically technologists, not necessarily business people, and you're the liaison between the business and the realization of all of these massive capital or operating expense investments. It's a lonely spot, and I think from what I've gathered, a lot of people in that IT leadership position, or even in the rank and file, that are they wonder if what they're thinking or what they're coming up with in terms of conclusions or realizations are just a figment of their imagination, or am I the only person thinking this, or am I the only person that's come to this conclusion, or am I the only person that feels like something's not right here, I'm getting screwed over, or whatever else it is. And so if I could give if there's anything we could do, my hope is we can just give somebody a sense of, no, you're not crazy. No, we're seeing this too. This is nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe what you're thinking has merit. Typically, you're probably not thinking crazy thoughts. You're probably thinking very sane and rational thoughts. You're just in a vacuum. So my hope is we're kind of busting open that vacuum and giving maybe an audience to people who have good ideas, or giving people who have some curiosities, maybe scratching that itch and giving them a sense of place. So, got it. Well, let's. I think that's a good place to stop. Cameron, thanks again for giving some thoughts and telling us a little bit about yourself, and also your kind of hopes and dreams for Cut the Shit. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a follow-up, a one-on-one with our other co-founder, Brian Law. Brian's background and path to IT was very different from Cameron's.
So we'll see how that plays out as he shares his thoughts and answers my questions. Like every other podcast out there, I'm required by some sort of universal law to encourage you to share this podcast with anyone and everyone who might be remotely interested in hearing an irreverent take on the arcane world of IT. You can find links to this podcast on our website at plow.net, on our YouTube and Instagram feeds, on Apple Podcasts, LinkedIn, hell, probably a bunch of other places too. Or just Google that shit. You'll find it for sure. Take care and have a good day.